Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode is called Electric Vehicles, Do Consumers Even Want Them? And you're here with me, Rebecca Bell-Chambers, Janina Mills, Lead Analyst for Consumer Insights, alongside Claudio Vittori, Associate Manager in E-Mobility Components Research. Hello to you both and thank you for joining me on this week's episode of Autology.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Cool. So this week's episode and the podcast is all about electrification and the consumer perspective. We're seeing a lot of push from all sides of the industry for electric vehicles and reducing emissions. But my first question to you would be, is this something that consumers actually want?
Difficult answer, but a quick answer would be yes and no. We run a global consumer survey on electrification annually, and we just recently completed the third iteration of this and found sort of an interesting change since its inception in 2019. So the first survey that was ran, we used that as a bit of a baseline. And we saw that consumer openness to electric and hybrid vehicles was around 58% and 63% respectively. And we saw a pretty big jump in 2021 when we ran the second iteration, which was about a 48% increase. But the most recent iteration that we ran in July of this year, we saw a dip. The openness to both electric and hybrid vehicles is still higher than the baseline that we saw in 2019, but now it's at around 71% and 73% respectively. So electric vehicles, 71, hybrids, 73. And there's always going to be a little bit of a gap between the EV and hybrid openness, with hybrids being a little bit higher just by the very nature of what they are. But the other interesting aspect is that the gap that we typically would see between EV and hybrid openness has gotten smaller as well. The reasons against purchasing an EV or hybrid has remained relatively the same. We've seen that price has become a pretty substantial barrier. And so, I mean, compared to the 2019 surveys that we saw that, charging station availability, charging time was typically a little bit higher, but pricing has taken the lead. And incentives might help this a little bit further, but I think education is where this would help the barrier a little bit more. We've seen that consumer confidence dipped in 2022. Similar to that openness that we saw dip. And it's mostly because consumers are they're opting to wait until the technology improves. In fact, we saw 64% claiming that they're waiting until the technology improves before they purchase an electric vehicle. And in less than half, so I think it was around 46%, that said that their next vehicle would be an EV. So I think there's a little bit of skepticism around electric vehicle technology, and a lot of it could be just around the bad publicity, around the potential safety and reliability concerns. The charging infrastructure perhaps may not be sufficient or reliable as well.
Rebecca, if I can chime in, probably I do have a couple of comments on what we said so far. I think, yes, the push is still there. The overall industry is pushing towards electrification overall, but the type of push is gradually changing over the years and over the months. And if we refer, for example, to the Inflation Reduction Act voted in August this year, we can see how the type of push is changing, because we are passing from a phase of where the incentivization were mainly referring to electric vehicles, now moving to certain sub-elements of the supply chain, like the manufacturing of the cars in specific regions, or the cars responding to some specific requirements, such as the amount of materials included into the batteries. So facilitating a sort of translation towards a more sustainable electrification process overall. And the second aspect goes to the consumer. That's also an interesting one. So far, we have seen a lot of incentives mainly referring to the electric vehicles purchase to reduce the upfront investments of having electric vehicles. But in the recent months and years, we have seen a lot of incentivization process kicking off in certain areas when it comes to, for example, charging stations. And if we look, for example, at some US states, such as California, we do see that's already the central government, central state, as well as the utilities operating the area are now promoting incentives related to the installation of charging station into the domestic and as well as in the public domain through different typology of support. So there is a push, yes, but the type of push and the type of consumer perception is gradually changing over the months.
Sure. Okay. So you mentioned that some of the purchasing barriers like pricing, as well as the charging availability and time. Can you tell us more about what some of the consumer expectations are with regard to the charging infrastructure or the charging technology?
Yeah, I can start this off. I guess our results show that owners and past owners most frequently charged at home, and as well as the intender group, they indicated that they would as well if they had owned one, and this is pretty standard. But many consumers didn't believe that the existing infrastructure was sufficient for their charging needs. We asked if they were aware of any charging stations near their home or workplace, and more than half said no across all countries. And again, we actually field this in 8 countries throughout the world. So, and we took it a step further. Respondents were also asked if they would be more likely to purchase an EV if there was a charging station available at their workplace. In last year's iteration, 70% said yes to this question. But in the latest version, that number has gone down quite a bit to about 38%, and 39% were unsure. So this seems to further emphasize I don't want to say deteriorating, but I'm going to, deteriorating consumer confidence around EV technology, or just a skepticism around this technology and the charging availability. There seems to be a lot of unknowns growing when last year showed a fair amount of optimism and eagerness, but it also seems to emphasize the need for not just easily accessible charging stations outside of the home, but also reliable ones. I think what some consumers are actually running into, and I've read about, a variety of anecdotal, posts and social media complaints, is that the current infrastructure is unreliable at times, with stations either being down for service or just not available. Other times it's a matter of having to wait for other customers. And on that note, results showed that consumers were willing to wait between 30 minutes and an hour for a full charge. And this is more situational. So we asked them what they would be willing to wait for an abnormal day, like an emergency situation or a vacation or a road trip, versus a normal day, just running errands, going to work, dropping kids at school, or something like that. But regardless of the scenario, wait times were the same. They would be willing to wait 30 minutes to an hour for a full charge. But of course, that obviously wouldn't really meet expectations if that same wait time is required just to use the charger because it's already in use. But there is a little bit of a bright side in this recent iteration of the survey, and in last year's, is that it's more along the lines of vehicle range and what they're willing to accept. Consumers are starting to understand the trade-offs a bit more, and they've showed that they're actually willing to accept a minimum mile range that's less than a traditional ICE vehicle or a gas vehicle. But with all of the newer EV models currently available and that are coming to market, this may be a little bit less of a concern moving forward, since a lot of them already fall in that range of what a typical ICE vehicle is capable of anyway.
And Janina, yeah, you have raised a lot of good points, honestly, especially regarding to the infrastructure usage and complaints that the typical users are raising these days. And you also say that the domestic landscape is today and expected to remain the main solution for all. This is something that is continuously confirmed from all the players into the industry. And regarding about about this topic, I think we can add a couple of interesting comments. In the recent years or months, we have seen a lot of, well, the major players operating the manufacturing of domestic charging station gradually expanding the offering towards DC wall boxes. So the new type of charging process happenings, not only into the high speed into the main road at high powered charging stations, but adopting the same technology at home. And this is probably an emerging trend into the domestic, into the overall industry, but specifically into the domestic area. This is probably something that is gonna be pushed also in the next future by some OEMs that are now moving in the direction of relying only into the DC charging capability. That's a case of some Chinese brands already in production now, not having AC capability on the vehicle side. As well as into the overall trend of making the connection with the grid and with an energy system more agile, more effective, and passing through, for example, a DC charging and enabling solutions like vehicle to grid and vehicle to home.
Okay, so you mentioned that there are some availability for fast charging stations, but am I right in thinking that this will most likely come at a higher cost? And is this something that consumers are willing to pay for?
At a high level, it's difficult to say because consumers will typically choose the lowest price every chance that they can. And it's obviously seems to be the case regardless of the charging scenario. And we asked consumers what they would be willing to pay, and specifically for two high-speed charging scenarios, one for a DC station of 150 kilowatt power output and another for a 250 plus kilowatt power output. And in both cases, they chose the lowest price tier. And this is across the board for every country. For example, for the US, that price range was from $10 to $15. And so this is also consistent with some of our data from the previous version in 2021 and in 2019. So typically, consumers are willing to pay the lowest price tier.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And let's say also the overall infrastructure market is growing, and within the different domains of infrastructure, the DC one is probably expected to be in the near future the real game changer, allowing all the users to fulfill the requirements of the trip and then completing you know the transition towards electric vehicles. And according to our estimation, the DC infrastructure, so the high-speed, high-powered charging station mainly installed into the main roads, is gonna increase. And only for Europe, the European market counts today about 300,000 DC charging stations, and we are expecting that in the next decade or so, this is gonna grow about 10 times from today's numbers. And the other sign of this, the importance of DC charging station deployment, is probably related to the willingness of Tesla, that has been traditionally a very vertical company and offering services to the users, is now opening the superchargers to all the other vehicles. The process is already ongoing in Europe due to the fact that the CCS connector was already in place. So the step to open up the network to all the others was much faster and easier. But there is already a plan of moving the same direction into the North America. So allowing more accessible points for all the users, and of course offering a solution that might facilitate the longer trip for all the users.
Okay, so going back to something you said a little bit earlier, Janina, you mentioned that consumers were more willing to accept electric vehicles below the typical range of an ICE vehicle, and that a lot of the electric vehicles are already offering this type of range anyway. So do you think that range anxiety is still a concern for consumers?
I would say yes. Range anxiety is still a thing and will likely continue to be until some of the bugs and the kinks are worked out from a technology standpoint, and more options become available in the market. Again, like I mentioned earlier, education, I think, is a big thing here as well. Consumers ultimately fear the unknown. And your average consumer may not come completely armed with all of the knowledge necessary for owning an EV and understand some of the nuances behind ownership. I saw a kind of a funnier editorial piece of a Tesla that ran out of power several feet from a charger. And it's little things like that that I think will keep range anxiety still a concern. And so, yes, granted, some of this could be user error, but again, I think it goes back to educating consumers on EV technology, on the infrastructure, and kind of what their options are that could help. In addition to obviously improving on the infrastructure is also a crucial part of this, to improve that reliability, that accessibility, which could help alleviate some of the range anxiety concerns.
Janina, let me add also in the vehicle side, the technology can be also facilitator having a more robust, education into the consumers on adopting electric vehicles. And on that front, I would say our estimation, if we look at the market today, about 20%, only 20% of the vehicles are now equipped with the battery range of battery capacity of above 80 kilowatt hour. But if we look at 2030, so in 10 years or so from now, we are considered that more than 50% of the vehicle will have such of a larger battery capability, battery size. So there are definitely some improvements into the vehicle technology due to the new chemistry in use now and all the projects that are going on. And as you said, of course, infrastructure will play a pivotal role in that. And not just in terms of deployment, in terms of capability in terms of having charging points spread on the country, on the regions, but also in terms of how efficient might be or might become the charging process. And in terms of vehicle side, again, we can see that most of the traditional 3 kilowatt charging power peak, which has been displayed in the first generations of electric vehicles, is going to gradually move towards 11 kilowatt as a charging peak power in terms of AC. So at home, when you were capable of charging at 3 kilowatt, in the near future, most of the vehicles will be capable of 11. At the same time, into the DC side, there is a sort of transition of having most of the cars by 2030 capable with the capability of charging 150 kilowatt plus in terms of DC charging power, which will mean speeding up the process of charging. And of course, this is going to happen mainly into the bit larger batteries, with the aim of maintaining the C rate comparable across all the segments and across all the offerings of electric vehicles.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting and really promising to see the technology that's coming down the line. So just before we wrap up today's episode, I'd like to just pick your brains and know what your thoughts are on whether or not you think that electrification is finally becoming mainstream.
Perhaps I can go first. I think some measures that have been implemented recently in terms of ban and towards the push on electrification will definitely help on spreading the deployment of electric vehicles. I think there is a still long way to do in terms of harmonization. We have made big progress in terms of connectors, for example. So in theory, in most of the regions, we have a correlation between region and connector to be used to charge your vehicles and in terms of availability at the charging stations. But when it comes to protocols and to roaming services, there is still a lot to do, and most of the players are now moving in this direction, as well as solving issues in terms of a reliable infrastructure network. So still few challenges ahead, but of course we are positive of having electrification process accelerating over the next months and years.
Yeah, and I think from a consumer perspective, there's still optimism, but there's a growing skepticism. So I think there's still a long way to go. As Claudio mentioned, it's still very promising. There's a lot of progress in the industry and in the technology, but I'm not sure that the consumer pull is there yet. And pushing something that consumers are not quite ready for, it could be risky in eliciting an opposite reaction. So there has to be a certain balance reached of a push and a pull strategy here before we can say that this is truly becoming mainstream. And I just don't think it's there yet.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. So I'd like to say a big thank you to you both for joining me on Nautology.
Thank
you
you.
for having us.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@spglobal.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all of the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcast. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.